Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you and welcome you to the Greater Boston Business and Professional Chapter of the John Birch Society, our June meeting of 2012. We're very pleased to have as our guest speaker Mr. Jim Perloff. Mr. Jim Perloff, I first bumped into him literally in 1988 at our old Belmont headquarters. I said, excuse me, he said, that's okay. And we didn't really meet until another 10 years formally. Jim is the author of what I think is probably the most important book we've ever published, The Shadows of Power.
That's right.
This was published in 1988, and it is still a very important book. And I think when you read this, if you haven't been exposed to this book and you read it, it will change your life, the way you look at things. And the thing is, he documents it with facts. This isn't all a bunch of conjecture. And I can say that this book was used to help save our Constitution. You say, oh, come on now, Hal, you're stretching the truth just a little bit. Well, we had a project in '88. We mailed copies of this book to every single state rep and senator in the country. As a result of that, we made a lot of friends. Probably made a few enemies too, but made a lot of friends. And some of those friends helped us defeat the Conference of the States a few years later as a result of getting this book. So you can put that on his laurels as well. Jim also authored a few books dealing with evolution versus creationism. Guess what side he takes? The creation side. And their books are available too. I look at him as a national treasure, and his topic today is on the federal. He's rolling his eyes. Oh, come on, Hal. Okay, how about a regional treasure? He's going to be talking about the Federal Reserve Bank and the Lindenburgh aspect. So let's give him a nice warm hand.
Pep up that next introduction, will you? He's already mentioned this. I don't want to plug too much what's on the book table there of mine, but there is The Shadows of Power, dealing with the Council on Foreign Relations and how it has dominated our foreign policy for over a century, driving us downwards and into the realm of world government. And two books, one long, one short, on creation versus evolution, and it's quite as relevant to conservatives as, you won't find too many liberals who believe in God. And Darwin basically wrote his books to basically dismantle people's belief in God. And once you give up on God, speak louder? Louder, okay. Then you're open to any kind of ideas, and you get the kind of crazy culture we see today. And also there's a music CD there. It's 12 politically incorrect songs, tribute to Vietnam vets, tribute to homeschoolers. We made it at a Christian music studio. Am I doing okay on sound?
Everybody hear him?
Really?
I'll say just
take
a mic
down
for the
here.
camera.
I just need to speak up as maybe we have a little background.
There's a group back here, so it's a little noisy in the back.
Okay, I'll try to speak up then. Okay. All right. Anyway, that is available also. Politically incorrect music. We made it a Christian music studio with 7 different vocalists. Well, the topic today is the Fed and the Lindenburghs, and how those relate will become apparent as the talk goes on. This is going to start with the Fed first. I'm sure you folks have noticed that we have rising prices in this country. Right? We've got inflation, and let's just take a trip down memory lane. In 1962, candy bar was a nickel. Postage stamp was 4 cents. Movie ticket was 50 cents. And a pair of sneakers was $5. How are we doing on sound? Okay? You guys can hear me? Okay. Tuition at Harvard that year was $1,520. You could buy a brand new imported Renault automobile for $1,395. And the cost of an average home in America was $12,500. Prices are going up. Well, why is that? Well, if you consult the establishment press, they'll say it's your fault. You know, it's the American workers' fault. You know, some guy goes to his boss, some guy named Joe, and says, "Boss, my wife's had a baby. Make it a $50 a week raise." And his boss says, "Well, Joe, I'd like to give you a raise, but the only way I can do that is by raising our prices $50 a week. I'll have to pass on the cost to the people we do business with." And so they raise their prices, and then the people they're doing business with will say, "Well, if you guys are raising your prices, we'll have to raise our prices $50 a week." So all across America, prices go up because Joe had a baby and asked for a raise. Joe and guys like him. We're told that inflation is inevitable. It's like death and taxes. You'll always have it. You know, it looks that way. You know, if you consult the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, you know for every year for the last 50 years, prices have gone up. So it looks like inflation's inevitable, but it's not. I'm going to prove that right now. This is a graph from Oregon State University, and its prices in America from 1665, the days of the Pilgrims, until now. Take a look at that graph. You know, for the first 250 years in America, we had zero net inflation. If you bought a pair of shoes in 1900, it would have cost you the same as it did back in the days of George Washington. But look at the right side of the graph. It takes off like a skyrocket. Now some people might say, well, it wasn't a flat line for those 250 years with the Perloff. That's right. There's some blips there. What are those blips? Those blips are wars. Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Civil War. What happened? The American government would print money to help pay for the wars. Of course, when you print money, the value of money goes down, and then prices go up. But notice that after each of those wars, the prices went back to their normal value. But check out World War I. This time, we inflate, and prices do not go back down to their normal value. And after the Great Depression, they just take off like a skyrocket. Something must have happened around the time of World War I to make this difference in the graph. What was it? It was the establishment of the Federal Reserve. Now, this picture, by the way, has not been photoshopped or anyway. Now, Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve Board have been called the economic czars of America. Why? Because they set interest rates. By setting interest rates, they also control the direction of the stock market. If interest rates go high, you know, CDs start to look good, people pull the money out of the stock market. But if interest rates go low like they are now, the money flows into the stock market. Now, how did the Federal Reserve get started? You ask those people, they'd say, I don't know, some act of our government, right? Yeah, it was the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. But the man who introduced the original legislation that became the Federal Reserve Act was Senator Nelson Aldrich. Now, many people today haven't heard of Aldrich, former boss of the Senate, but a lot of people remember this man, Nelson Rockefeller, who was vice president under Gerald Ford, a billionaire, long governor of New York, one of the most powerful men in the world. His full name was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. It was named for his grandfather, Nelson Aldrich. His daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., and his son, Winthrop Aldrich, became head of the Rockefeller Chase Bank. Now, when he spoke on Capitol Hill, people knew that Senator Aldrich was speaking for the Rockefellers, and here's what you need to know about the Federal Reserve legislation. He didn't write it. It was written at a secret meeting, secret 9-day meeting by the world's richest bankers on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. Now, Jekyll Island is open to the public today, but at that time it was a private retreat of the Vanderbilts and the Astors and the Morgans and the Rockefellers. Now, some people would say, Mr. Perloff, I don't believe there's a Jekyll Island meeting. That's just some kooky conspiracy theory. Well, actually, Jekyll Island is open to the public today. If you go down there, you can go to the Jekyll Island Club Hotel, and they will show you their Federal Reserve room. That's what they call it. That's the room where the Federal Reserve was planned. The first man to report on the Jekyll Island meeting was actually B.C. Forbes, then a reporter, the founder of Forbes magazine. One of the men who attended the meeting described it in his memoirs, and that was Frank Vanderlip. You've all heard of Citibank? Well, it used to be called the National City Bank, and it was a pretty nasty bank in its day. Frank Vanderlip was its president, and here's what he wrote in 1935. There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We instructed to come one at a time, and as unobtrusively as possible, to the terminal of the New Jersey Littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness, attached to the rear end of the train for the South. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboos that had been fixed on last names. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen. If it were to be discovered that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance, whatever, of passage by Congress. Now, who's at the meeting? Well, the men at this meeting represented 25% of all the wealth in the world at that time. The world's 3 biggest banking houses were represented. Now, representing the House of Rockefeller were Frank Vanderlip and Senator Aldrich. And representing the House of Morgan, J.P. Morgan, were left to right Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, Henry Davison, senior partner in J.P. Morgan and Company, and Charles Norton, head of Morgan's First National Bank of New York. But the man who ran the meeting, the most important man, was a man there representing the European Rothschild interest, Paul Warburg. Now, many people today haven't heard of Paul Warburg, but if you ever seen the musical Annie or the comic book Little Orphan Annie, you recall this? Annie had a rich benefactor, Daddy Warbucks, the richest man in the world. Well, he was actually a caricature of Paul Warburg. The artist simply took the name Warburg and changed it to Warbucks. Actually, if you're looking for a fictional character to represent Paul Warburg, I don't think Daddy Warbucks was a very good one. I think this man would be a better representative. Well, who was Paul Warburg? Paul Warburg was a German banker, and he worked in cohesion with the Rothschilds in Europe to set up central banks from which they greatly profited. And in 1902, the Rothschilds sent Warburg to America with instructions to found a similar central bank here in the United States. As soon as he got here, he became a partner in Kuhn-Loeb Company, which was the Rothschild banking satellite in New York City. And he quickly established an alliance with John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, which was nothing new because the Rothschilds had provided John D. with the seed money for the Standard Oil Company and had bailed out J.P. Morgan when his firm was in trouble in the 19th century. Now in 1907, J.P. Morgan, through his newspaper, started a rumor about the insolvency of some rival banks, and that led to runs on these banks. And if you've seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life, you've seen an example of a run on the bank. It used to be, you know, banks of course make money by loaning out money on deposit, but if the depositors panicked and they all went to the bank and wanted their money at once, it could collapse, and that's what happened to these rival banks. Now, following that, Morgan's newspapers and John D. Rockefeller's newspapers and Senator Aldrich and Congress began clamoring, America must have a central bank so we won't have any more of these financial crises. But why do they want a central bank? Well, who do you suppose that Woodrow Wilson appoints as the first vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board who will set America's interest rates? Ta-da! Paul Warburg. And who gets to be head of the New York Federal Reserve, the most important bank in the system? Benjamin Strong. The very guys who sat at Jekyll Island and set up this bank were now given control of it. The Foxes were running the hen house. But why do they want this central bank? Well, Paul Warburg was making a salary at Kuhn-Loeb of $500,000 a year. That was a lot of money back then. That's like over 10 million in today's dollars. But he gave that up for a position on the Federal Reserve Board that paid only $12,000 a year. Why? Patriotic altruism? No, the guy who just came here from Germany. Paul Warburg said, why should I make a piddling $500,000 a year when I can make countless millions for myself and my friends in high finance by setting interest rates in this country? I snap my fingers once, the stock market will go down. I snap them twice, the stock market will go up, which is reason number one. They want to control the stock market. But reason number two is really well explained in this book, which Hal has already mentioned. I can't recommend it highly enough. The Preacher from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. Another thing they were looking to do was to create money from nothing. Now, you know we have a very expensive government. The Obama administration is running a deficits of over $1 trillion a year, not a budget, but a deficit. And that means that every day of the year, our government spends about $3 billion more than it takes in. Now, how does our government take in money? Through income tax, right, and by selling bonds. But bonds are actually a lousy way to fund the government. That's money you got to repay later with interest, right? But even with all the money our government gets from income tax and bonds, it still doesn't get enough. It still spends $3 billion or more each day than it takes in. Now, how can they do that? How do they keep paying government employees and Medicare recipients and defense contractors? Well, J. Edward Griffin explains it in his book. Let's say that this week the government needs $1 billion to pay the salaries of the federal employees, and they don't have the billion. Where do they get it? They send a representative of the Treasury over to the Federal Reserve Building, which is on the right. And at that building, the Office of the Federal Reserve writes out a check for $1 billion to the U.S. Treasury. But here's what you need to know. This is not based on assets that the Fed holds. It's fiat money. It's money created from nothing. Now, if you or I did that, we wrote a check with no assets to back it up, we go to jail. The Fed does it, it's legal. Now, why do they want this system? Well, it's like this gigantic counterfeiting machine. It means now they can have these huge contracts in modern day with Bechtel, Halliburton, give them billions of dollars created out of nothing. How about your Wall Street bailout recently, $700 billion. Money created from nothing by Geithner and Bernanke. There's another way as well that Jim Griffin points out. These guys were pretty smart. Now, we were talking about the Federal Reserve would create the money from nothing to pay $1 billion in federal salaries, right? Well, what are the federal employees going to do with their salaries? They're going to go deposit that money at the bank. We've just created $1 billion in bank deposits out of nothing. How does a bank make money? By loaning out the money on deposit. And actually, this $1 billion that's been created from nothing becomes $10 billion to the bank. $10 billion in loanable deposits, because according to the Federal Reserve's rules, you have to have only $1 on deposit for every 10 that you loan out. Now, what did that mean for the bankers? It meant endless profits. But what did it mean for us? Endless inflation. Check the graph. Nothing but inflation ever since the Fed was created. Now, this is a picture of a woman in Germany in 1923, and look what she's doing. She's using money as fuel for a stove. You might have heard of the German hyperinflation of the 1920s. Germany had to pay a war debt to the Allies after the war, so to pay it, they printed scads of money. It was so bad, one loaf of bread cost 200 million marks, 200 billion marks. People would go down the street with their money in a wheelbarrow. When the Federal Reserve creates money from nothing, they're doing the same thing. Our inflation is not that bad, but every time the Fed creates money from nothing, and they don't have to print it today, they can just create it electronically. Every time they do that, the value of money goes down and prices go up. Now, politicians love this. You know why? It means they can spend money without raising taxes. You know, George Bush fought the war in Iraq, didn't have to raise taxes. The Federal Reserve just creates the money from nothing. Politicians know that if they raise taxes, we'll blame them. But if they spend money through inflation, we won't blame Washington. They figure we'll just blame the local retail store. We'll say, how come you guys are jacking up your prices? Well, the problem isn't rising prices. The problem is that the value of the dollar is going down, and the culprit is the Fed. Now, the bankers had a problem, though. You know, they figured a way to create billions of dollars in deposits out of nothing, but the deposits still belong to the depositors. To be profitable, they had to loan it to somebody. Now, do you think they wanted to loan it to a guy like me? No way. My business might go belly up. Maybe I won't repay the loan. Now, they want to loan the money to one man in particular, this man, Uncle Sam. Right back to the government that they got it from. Why? Because Uncle Sam's not going to go belly up, and nobody's going to borrow more money than Uncle Sam. So the Federal Reserve also was authorized to buy and sell bonds for the federal government, and they're going to buy up those bonds, of course, their own banks and investment houses. But they still had a problem. Now we figured a way to loan money to the government that we create out of nothing. How are the American people going to pay back the interest on these loans, on these bonds? Because at that time, the federal government had very few sources of revenue. The main one was tariffs. So they came up with a new source of revenue for the federal government, which was the income tax. Now, there was no income tax in this country before 1913. It was not in the Constitution, and in 1895, the Supreme Court said income tax is unconstitutional. So the only way the bankers could get income tax enacted was through an amendment to the Constitution. Who introduced the legislation for that amendment? Senator Nelson Aldrich, the same man who introduced the Federal Reserve legislation. Now, why was it that the American people accepted an income tax? You know why? Because Nelson Aldrich said, upon my word of honor, income tax will never exceed 1% of the working man's income. That's what it was. The original income tax was 1% of your income on salaries up to $20,000, which would be like $500,000 in today's bucks. So Americans said, well, the income tax is going to be just 1%, and I can always keep the other 99%. I can give 1% to Uncle Sam. That's not a big deal. But you know what happened? The government raised it a smidge, and another smidge, until now we're all paying, what, 15, 25, 28, 33% of our income to the federal government, depending on bracket, right? Because the bankers understood a principle. You want to boil a frog, you can't toss that frog in boiling water, he'll jump right out. You want to boil a frog, put him in lukewarm water, and just gradually turn up that heat. And that frog will never know he's been boiled. And that's what they did with the American taxpayers. Started them off at 1% and just gradually turned them up to 30%. No. Some people would say, Mr. Perloff, that's impossible because income tax soaks the rich. Yeah. A guy who's making 100 grand, 200 grand, he gets soaked. Not these guys. You know, in 1970, when I was 18, we were in downtown Boston for Kelly labor at minimum wage, $1.80 an hour. But I paid more income tax that year than Nelson Rockefeller, the billionaire. He didn't pay 1 cent. We know that because he made his income tax forms public. He had to when he became vice president. 1933, the Pecora hearings of Congress investigated J.P. Morgan found he had not paid 1 penny in income tax during either of the 2 previous years, 1931 and 1932. Income tax is for you, not for these guys. Now, in 1913, the bankers have figured out a way to create money from nothing. They will loan to the American people, and they've also created the income tax in 1913, which will force the American people to repay the interest on the loans. Now, only one thing's missing. If only the American government had a reason to borrow a lot of money, if only something would happen, it would cause the American government to borrow a lot of money. What happened in 1914? World War I begins, we joined, and as a result, our debt went from a rather manageable $1 billion to $25 billion today. It's through the stratosphere, right around 10 trillion, right? And by the way, there was a limited audit of the Fed done, and the picture's even worse, revealing that actually there's been trillions in bailouts. These are mostly 0% interest loans at easy repayment terms, but look at the recipients. Citigroup getting this is from 2007 to 2010. Citigroup getting 2.5 trillion, not billion, 2.5 trillion. Morgan Stanley 1.9, and so forth. Trillions of dollars. It's crazy. Now, young people today are really struggling, and a young man might say, you know, my great-grandfather came to this country at the turn of the century, and, you know, he had his own home, worked 1 job, 7 kids, his wife never had to work outside the home. How'd they do it? You know, me and Mindy, we're working 2 jobs, and we got 1 kid, we can barely pay the rent. What are we doing wrong? Well, it's not what they're doing wrong. See, when great-granddad came here, there was no income tax. For the average worker today, shows about 50% of his income, pays it out in taxes. When you take your federal income tax, state income tax, Social Security tax, real estate tax, sales tax, and excise tax, there goes half your income. Does it make sense? You spend half your money on taxes. You now need 2 jobs to maintain the same standard of living. Plus, great-grandpa had a stable dollar, worth the same from 1 year to the next. Now our dollar's losing about 9%. They say inflation is 4%. They just keep revising the way they figure the CPI. It's actually about 9% now. And young people are being flat. But the culprit is not you, and it's not the young people. The culprit is the Fed. Well, part 2 of my talk is on the Lindenburghs. You might think, well, how does that possibly relate to this topic? A lot of people have heard of Charles Lindbergh, the aviator, of course, first man to fly the Atlantic, solo, right? But a lot of people don't know his father, on the right there, Charles Lindbergh Sr., was a congressman, and as such, is probably the leading opponent of the Federal Reserve. He tried to have the whole board impeached, you know that? And he tried to have the act stopped. He opposed the Federal Reserve Act, and he understood exactly what was going on. And here's what he said on the floor of the House when this act was up for debate. He said, this act, the Federal Reserve Act, establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this act, the invisible government, by the money power, what does he mean by money power? He's talking about the alliance between the houses of Rockefeller, Morgan, and Rothschild, proven to exist when the money trust investigation will be legalized. The money power overawes the legislative and executive forces of the nation. I've seen these forces exerted during the different stages of this bill. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. The new law will create inflation whenever the trust wants inflation. Check it out, was he right? Look at that. For 250 years, 0 net inflation. After the Fed skyrocketed inflation. Lindbergh saw exactly what was coming. Continuing with his quote, that if the trust can get a period of inflation, they figure they can unload stocks on the people at high prices during the excitement, and then bring on a panic and buy them back at low prices. People may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. Again, he was exactly right. What was that day of reckoning? Stock market crash, 1929. You know what? When the market crashed, millions of small investors were wiped out. Do you know that Paul Warburg, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan were all out of the stock market? Because they were wise? No. When you're running the Federal Reserve, you know the direction interest rates are going to take. By the way, they also sold the market short heavily and used other tricks to get the panic rolling, and they moved back in. As I said, Congressman Lindenburgh tried to get the entire Federal Reserve Board impeached. He died in 1924, and we be sure that Wall Street breathed a big sigh of relief. That Lindenburgh's out of our hair, we don't have to worry about this guy anymore. But Charles Lindenburgh had one son. He had two daughters and he had one son, Charles Lindenburgh Jr. there, who you see, when he was about 8 years old. And then the amazing happened. There was a prize for the first man who could cross the Atlantic. And Lindenburgh did it. It was an amazing achievement. I consider it almost miraculous. You know, this kid, he's 25. You know, he designed that plane, the entire plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. He oversaw every step of production. He's the only guy to try to go across the Atlantic alone. Nobody else dared. The other crews went up and they crashed. 2, 3, 4 pilots. They figured they had to take turns sleeping. He went across. He didn't sleep for 52 hours when he touched down in Paris. It was a miracle. I say this probably because when you think about it, what were the odds that the man who was the greatest enemy of the satanic Wall Street elite, that his only son would rise to oblivion? This guy was a mail pilot. He was running the airmail route from Chicago to St. Louis. Rose from oblivion to become the most admired man in the world. I consider that quite miraculous. And you can be sure a shudder went through Wall Street when that happened. They said, if this guy becomes president, you know what's going to happen? He's going to put his father's policies in action. He's going to take down the Federal Reserve and we're all going to be wiped out. And they didn't have to worry, though, because this kid was still only 25. He couldn't even run for president for another 10 years. There's still a lot of time. But he was quickly branded an enemy by Franklin D. Roosevelt. 1934, he told his press secretary, don't worry about Lindenburgh. We'll get that fair-haired boy. And the press started to turn on Lindenburgh. Yeah, a lot of you know that he was involved in something called the America First Committee. Let me just explain. His father used the phrase America First a lot. He was against World War I, his father, and people accused him of being pro-German. Same thing happened with Lindenburgh Jr. People said, he's a Nazi because he doesn't want to get into war. No, he said, the purpose of our armed forces, number one, is to defend America, not to defend other countries. But Roosevelt labeled him a Nazi, and all of a sudden, pictures like this started appearing in the press. Here you see Adolf Hitler pinning a SWAT sticker on Lindenburgh, Heil Lindenburgh, and Lindenburgh's got his hand up in a Nazi salute with a big smile on his face, right? Let me tell you what this is actually based on. In the 1930s, Lindenburgh was invited to Germany by the U.S. Air Attaché to investigate the Luftwaffe. The Germans were delighted to have a celebrity come over. They let him fly and run their warplanes. He provided that information on Germany's Air Force and its status to the Army Air Corps. And Arnold, head of the Army Air Corps, said Lindenburgh's information was invaluable. Without it, we would not have been ready to fight the Germans. But one night, the American ambassador invited Lindenburgh to dinner when he was over there, and also the representative of the German government were there. And Hermann Goering came up to Lindenburgh and said, you know, other countries, Mr. Lindenburgh, have honored you for your transatlantic flight. Germany's never done so. We'd like to give you this medal. It was in a box, okay? And Lindenburgh said thanks, and that's all that happened. And the ambassador said, Lindenburgh did the right thing. If he refused that medal, it would have created a diplomatic incident. We were not at war at that time. But in the press, it became Hitler pinning a medal on Lindenburgh. He never even met Adolf Hitler, okay? If you have any doubts about this guy's patriotism, remember this, as soon as the war started, he volunteered for combat. And FDR gave orders, no, this guy's not going to be in the armed forces, not to protect him, but to make sure that Lindenburgh didn't resurrect his own reputation. So Lindenburgh said, okay, if I can't fight, can I be a civilian advisor to the Air Force? So Roosevelt couldn't say no to that. So they let him be a civilian advisor, but I'll tell you, as soon as he got out to the Pacific, he started going up on combat missions. He flew 50 combat missions, engaged in dogfights with Japanese fighter pilots who were half his age. This guy was a patriot. Let nobody fool you. I'm going to finish by talking about one of the great mysteries, enduring mysteries of the 20th century, which is the Lindenburgh kidnapping. Believe it or not, we're even going to tie this into the fit. Now, Charles Lindenburgh had 6 children with his wife, Anne, who was also a pilot. Their first child, Charles Lindenburgh Jr., very cute little type, on March the 1st, 1932, was kidnapped from his second-story nursery at a home the Lindenburghs were building. And a ransom note was left there, and outside the police found this ladder and a chisel. And one of these strange things about this was that the kidnappers seemed to have inside information. They knew where the nursery was, and normally the Lindenburghs only stayed at this house on weekends because it was under construction. But this particular week they decided to stay over because the baby was ill. And the kidnappers couldn't have done that without a tip. So some people think there was a servant somewhere in the household who was giving them this information. Well, Lindenburgh paid the ransom, $50,000, which is about $1 million today's money. You know what he got in return? His son's body was dumped in a burlap bag off the road about 4 miles from his home. That's what he got in return. And the nation was outraged. They wanted, who did this? Who did this, right? But for 2.5 years, the case went nowhere. Now, the man in charge of the investigation was Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., the father of Stormin' Norman, who was head of the New Jersey State Police. For 2.5 years, didn't turn up a suspect. 2.5 years, the case drags on. It's actually the New York City police who found someone, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, who was a carpenter up in the Bronx. He paid at a gas station with a $10 bill. It was Lindenburgh ransom money. But the police went to his home, and they found he had about $15,000 more. They said, where'd you get this money? He said, well, I had a business associate named Azura Fish. He went to Germany and left me this box. He said, to what? And I said, I'd be happy to. Well, he died when after he went to Germany. And after he died, they got the word, and his brothers coming here to settle his estate. I opened up the box, and lo and behold, here's his money. He said, well, Fish owed me $7,000, which I can prove. He said, I started to spend it. And he said, he and his wife said, do you think we'd be spending this money in our own neighborhood where everybody knows us? If we knew this Lindenburgh ransom money? The police didn't believe that story, though. They called it a Fish story. And he was extradited to New Jersey. He was prosecuted by a very powerful figure in the Democratic Party, the Attorney General, David Wilentz. In the newspapers, it looked like Wilentz had an open and shut case. He had 2 eyewitnesses who said they saw Hauptmann near the Lindenburgh's estate at the time of the kidnapping. He had 8 handwriting experts say that this is the man who wrote the notes. And he told the jury, he said, look, we found a 3/4 inch chisel outside the home. This guy's a carpenter, right? When the police found his tools, the 3/4 inch chisel was missing. Obviously it was his chisel, right? Well, he was sentenced to death in the electric chair, but Harold Hoffman, New Jersey's Republican governor, started getting reports that there was a lot of things wrong with this case. He heard reports of perjury, police suppressing evidence, and he started to investigate, and he gave Hauptmann stays of execution. But he did this despite it being attacked by the press as being protecting a child murderer. But he could only give Hauptmann so many stays of execution. Time ran out. Hauptmann went to the chair, kneeled in prayer, and died. And then the case was forgotten about, except by his wife, his widow, Anna Hauptmann, who for 60 years fought to prove her husband's innocence. Right into her 90s, she was still fighting. And she finally got some rewards in the 1970s and 80s when these books came out, Scapegoat by Anthony Scudoto and a book by Leo Kennedy, a British journalist. They proved that Hauptmann was railroaded to the electric chair. Now, I've written an article on this, which is available online at newamerican.com. And it was in a recent issue of the New American. I don't want to belabor it too much, but let me just explain what I mean by railroaded. Hauptmann didn't have money for an attorney. He was in jail, he couldn't work. So the Hearst Press, you might know William Randolph Hearst was the father of what they call yellow journalism. They had one of his boys go to Anna Hauptmann and said, listen, we'll get you the best attorney in return for exclusive interviews. So she hopped at the chance. She soon regretted it. The attorney they got, Edward Riley, was a drunk. He was landed 2 years later after the trial in a lunatic asylum, suffering the effects of syphilis. Before the trial, he said Hauptmann is guilty and should burn. That's what William Randolph Hearst, who hired him, said also. He was frequently seen boozing up with the prosecution team. And he only spent 40 minutes with Hauptmann before the trial even began. He was dead drunk the night before the trial began. Now, outside, the police had found this ladder, right? There were 500 fingerprints on it. Guess what? Not one belonged to Hauptmann. When Norman Schwarzkopf learned that, he said, wash those fingerprints off. It's destruction of evidence. There were the footprints, at least 2 or 3 men, one of whom wore a size 8 shoe outside. The police took casts of it. By the time of the trial, that all disappeared. Hauptmann didn't wear a size 8 shoe. By the way, there's no way he could have done it alone. Policemen tried to reenact his abduction alone, single-handedly. None of them could carry a package up that ladder in there and come back down the ladder. Nobody could do it alone. It had to be teamwork. Now, Wilentz said that 8 handwriting experts to say that Hauptmann wrote the ransom notes. Well, he paid him $33,000 to do that. That's more than the entire defense budget. Experts will testify whoever pays their fees. Now, Hauptmann could only afford 1 expert, But since then, many objective people who are not being paid have said he didn't write those notes. Wilentz lied many times. He told the jury that Hauptmann's 3/4-inch chisel was missing when the police confiscated his tools. Anthony Scuduto, one of the writers who investigated this, found this was untrue. He found the original police receipts for Hauptmann's tools, including 2 3/4-inch chisels, a Bucks Brothers and a Stanley. And he found those chisels in storage in the Trenton, New Jersey headquarters of the New Jersey State Police. Wilentz was lying. Now, the 2 eyewitnesses that placed Hauptmann near the Lindenburgh estate were also perjured, were perjuring themselves. One was Amandus Hochmuth, 87 years old, unknown to defense, legally blind, and when Governor Hoffman interviewed him, he couldn't identify a flower vase 10 feet away. And admitted to the prosecution beforehand he could not identify Hauptmann. The other guy was an illiterate woodsman named Millard Whitehead, a neighbor of the Lindenburghs, and after the kidnapping he told police, "I didn't see nothing." But 2 years later, offered $1,000 reward money. He came forward and said, "Yeah, I seen Hauptmann." That was their case. Bruno Richard Hauptmann actually was a fine man. He was working as a carpenter with the better carpenters in the Bronx for 11 years, never arrested in this country on any crime. And he's the guy with the guitar back there. There you see him with some of his evil gang members. Here's more of his evil gang. He's the guy in the middle. Right of the Capone mob, right? Here's the brutal child killer. You know, in the courtroom, Wilentz, who looks like he's part of the Capone mob, the prosecutor said this of Bruno Hauptmann. He said, "He's a fellow that has ice water in his veins, not blood, an animal lower than the lowest form in the animal kingdom. No heart, no soul." He demanded the death penalty, not life imprisonment. And then something else really strange happened. The judge got up and delivered his charge to the jury. But instead of just telling the jury to weigh the facts, he argued for 1 hour and 10 minutes on behalf of the prosecution and ridiculed the arguments of the defense. There should have been a mistrial. The jury went to deliberate, and while they're trying to deliberate the case, a mob was permitted to surround the courthouse, chanting, "Kill Hauptmann, kill Hauptmann." This trial was a blot on American justice. Well, Scuduto and Kennedy demonstrated Hauptmann was indeed railroaded to the electric chair. But they didn't ask or answer the question of who did kidnap the Lindenburgh baby. But the establishment press had a very quick answer. They said, "You know, it was Lindenburgh himself kidnapped and killed that baby." And this all started with a book called Crime of the Century. And this idea has been so firmly planted in the American mind that Burgess has told me, when I started writing this, I said, "Oh, I heard Lindenburgh did it, you know, I have some source material on that." I said, "I don't think so." Here's what they say in this book. They said that Lindenburgh himself climbed up that ladder because he wanted to play a practical joke on his wife when they come through the front door and say, "Look who's with me in New York all day." But clumsy Lindenburgh dropped his baby, killing it. But Lindenburgh, not caring about the baby, but only about his own reputation, threw the baby in his car, drove 4 miles, threw the baby into the roadside, drove back 4 miles, went into his study, concocted his kidnapping scheme, wrote a ransom note to himself, went upstairs and planted it in the nursery before the baby's nurse returned. That's what they say, and many people believe that to this day. But understand this, if Charles Lindbergh wanted to play a practical joke on his wife, he had a sturdy ladder in his garage. This ladder didn't belong to Lindbergh. If you look at the slats on that thing, they're spaced wide apart.